Welcome, everybody. It's me, Stephen Billings. With me, of course, as always, is Andrew Cabral. And
Hello, hello.
how you doing, guys?
Doing
We're going to
good,
do
doing
another
good.
bonus interview for you. This was one that I've been talking with this guy for a little while through email and trying to get it set up, and we finally got it together. And our my first engagement with him was through this. We got the Shelf Shock Rewind Awards happening that me and Ryan from Disconnected are putting together, and we put out the nominations. And one of my favorite releases from last year, the Severin release of Out of the Blue,
Yes.
is one that I really love and I've been championing. And these guys saw that we had nominated it for a few things, and we're like, yes, please nominate, do it, and they were being really cool and sharing the stuff that we had out there. And I just got in touch with John Allen Simon, and Elizabeth Kerr is his partner over at Discovery Productions, and John was kind enough to join us today. So we're going to talk to John Allen Simon. How you doing?
Hi there. Nice to see you, Stephen and Andrew.
Hello.
I'm here in Los Angeles, so we're geographically distanced. We won't be getting the COVID from this interview, I guess.
I'm glad we don't have to wear masks. That would be bad for video. But we appreciate you coming on, taking the time.
My pleasure.
So, of course, we're definitely going to very much talk about this great release here that you guys did the restoration for. I guess let's just start out. Before, we do want to get into the background of John Allen Simon's career, but let's just talk really up to the top. Out of the blue, when did the idea for getting this restoration done start? Obviously you were there at the beginnings where when the movie was first coming out and you helped Dennis Hopper shop it around, but then when it came to the point of needing to restore it and then put it out again, what was the birth of that?
Well, the birth of it was that, like you said, I've been with it since the beginning. I had a small company that I had started in New Orleans when I was a film critic, and then I released a movie called The Wicker Man that did very well.
I've heard of that one.
Got a lot of notoriety. Time Magazine did a full-page article about my kind of rescuing lost films, and I was deluged with a lot of terrible movies, but one of them was Out of the Blue, and I remember screening it in this tiny screening room all by myself at Highland and Hollywood Boulevard in Los Angeles. I had just moved out here, and I literally fell out of my chair. I loved the movie so much. And with The Wicker Man, I'd taken Christopher Lee kind of around the country doing kind of very guerrilla kind of distribution and marketing on the movie. And I thought, well, if Dennis will help with this, I could do it again on Out of the Blue. So we met and hit it off right away. I had a little office on the rooftop on Brighton Way in Beverly Hills with a partner I had at the time. And Dennis came up to this office. He goes, "Oh, man, do you know where you are?" And that was kind of a Dennis Hopper question. And I said, "Yeah, I think I know where I am. Yeah." And he goes, no, this was my production office for Easy Rider. So by weirdest of coincidences, my little office had been his little office. So we hit it off, and he agreed to kind of help me market and distribute it. And we released it fairly successfully. It broke the house record in Boston. I can get into this a little bit more, but we did real well with it and became good friends. And ultimately, we ended up acquiring worldwide rights as well as U.S. rights, because the tax shelter group that had been involved with the movie, I'll get into that later, that's part of the whole kind of fascinating saga of this movie, kind of wanted out on the movie. So we took over worldwide rights. And in 2010, I think it was, we did a 35 millimeter restoration of the movie with some help from the Cinémathèque Française and the Thompson Foundation. Dennis was still with us at the time, and it was part of it had its world premiere at Cinémathèque Française in Paris as part of a month-long Dennis Hopper retrospective of his photography and his art and his movies. It was the premiere and centerpiece, and Dennis got to go to Paris for that, which was great. And then we had struck two 35 millimeter prints, one that we've kept in Paris with Cinémathèque Française, and really shown almost entirely at high-end festivals and museums, and very careful 35 millimeter types of screenings. And same thing in the U.S. We screened at Anthology Film Archives in New York, and at the Museum of Modern Art, and at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, places. They're very careful, but no matter how careful people are, ultimately there's wear and tear on prints. And these two prints were beginning to get distressed. And I thought, well, this is a good time to do a digital restoration. And one of my friends and consultants in the technical area has always been Robert Harris, who was the principal restoration producer of Lawrence of Arabia,
Wow.
and Rear Window and The Godfather and Bridge on the River Kwai and My Fair Lady. And I looked to him for some advice, and he referred me to a terrific post house in Burbank called Roundabout Entertainment. And I went in there and worked with them on this 4K restoration. But what we discovered was that there really were no funding sources to help us out with it, like had been around for the 35 millimeter restoration. So my wife and producing partner, Elizabeth Carr, is great on social media. And we had done a Kickstarter for an indie film that I directed and adapted from a Philip K. Dick novel called Radio Free Albemuth, and Elizabeth had kind of spearheaded that Kickstarter. So we thought we would do one again, and did one for Out of the Blue. And along with our own funds, we're able to do this restoration and re-release. And we were, so that's the origins. And then because I'm a former journalist and love doing interviews, do a lot of them for the British Academy of Film and Television Arts that I've been a member and board member of and committee chair of, and for the Writers Guild, which I have been a chair on the genre committee and active in. I just kind of went crazy doing bonus features and interviews on Out of the Blue. And of course, this was one case where the pandemic helped us, because instead of having to travel all over to get to people, I was able to do most of them on Zoom. The ones in LA I did with people in person for the most part, but a lot of them I did on Zoom, and people kind of accepted that, I guess, because of the pandemic. And we've got over 15 hours of bonus material. I started doing them for the British release, where we had a lot of them, but then just kept doing them and still doing them. So when we do a Japanese and German release, there'll be even more interviews and bonus features, not just with cast and crew, but also with people who knew Dennis and were very influenced him, like the filmmaker, artist Julian Schnabel, and Ethan Hawke, and Lawrence Schiller, and
Alex Cox.
Alex Cox, and our friend Brian Cox, who wanted to do something for it when he saw it at the New York premiere. One of the great things Elizabeth did was she kind of was listening to All Things Considered on NPR, and Natasha Lyonne was talking about Russian Doll. And then all of a sudden she started talking about what a great movie Out of the Blue was. And we happened to be going to a Netflix event soon after that, and approached Natasha and told her what we were doing. And we knew Chloe Sevigny was a big fan of the movie. And Natasha and Chloe helped support the restoration and came on board as presenters to kind of help get the word out on it. So that's a fairly long-winded, but could even be more long-winded story of how the restoration came about. And then Severin was a company that friends of mine knew and had worked with, and David Gregory, who runs Severin, had done a great re-release of The Wicker Man. So I knew him from that when he was with Anchor Bay, and they were very excited about kind of doing more art house type films away from kind of the horror and psychotronic exploitation kind of movies they're kind of noted for. And they were great partners for us in doing the restoration. So we're very pleased to have worked with them, and it's been very successful. And we did a UHD release too, which we hadn't done in the UK. And that just looks exquisite and beautiful. I went back to Roundabout and worked on it there with their technical people, and very pleased. We did the restoration from the restored 35 millimeter negative, and we were very proud that we were invited to premiere it at the Venice Film Festival. Out of the Blue originally premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 1980. So it might be the only movie to ever premiere at both Cannes and Venice.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah. And it's, it's a film that, of course, just kind of, it's a timeless movie, the themes and I think the attitude that Dennis Hopper had when it came to filmmaking is something that you still see a lot of filmmakers trying to emulate. Some of them are there more than others, but it's hard to break through. He struggled for years, and I think, one filmmaker that he was really, and you're a big fan of him, Andrew, Orson Welles,
Indeed.
him and Orson Welles have this same thing, and there's a great I haven't got a chance to watch it yet, but I hear it's great. A great documentary of a conversation between them two that came out a couple years ago. But, to see a filmmaker that was kind of, they're two filmmakers that you wish you could have seen more of. And, that just had struggled with Hollywood letting them do what they wanted to do. And, it's just great that you've, like you said, you're known for trying to get lost films out there and do that. And I'm just so glad that you were able to put this together the way you did. And honestly, I get a little trepidatious about 4K restorations for older films, but I think the work that was done on this restoration, I think looks like it doesn't try to take all the grain out. The colors are not too poppy. Was that something that was important to you to make sure that it wasn't
keeping the original aesthetic?
Being that you knew Dennis, did you have a trouble thinking about not changing the look of the film too much?
I tried not to really change it at all. Dennis really trusted me back when we did the original video transfers for home video, for video cassette, and then for DVD when it first came out in 2000. He trusted me to do the transfers, and we talked all the time about the look of the movie, and so I knew how it should look from having seen it so many times in 35 millimeter, and I didn't want it to look very different. There was one shot that had always bothered me in the movie. I don't think I ever talked about it with Dennis, where it's just framed a little too perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you know this, but movies are matted when they're screened in 35 millimeter. The image is actually quite a bit bigger.
Yeah.
Every theater mats it a little differently. So I was inclined, I thought very long and hard about maybe just making the shot a little asymmetrical, because the movie is not like a Jim Jarmusch movie where he's got the camera kind of stuck in one place, or Wes Anderson movie, I should probably say, and everything is just very symmetrical, and that's the aesthetic. It's not like that at all. It's more like a Cassavetes movie, more handheld and more guerrilla style filmmaking. But so I thought about doing that, and then I thought, no, I've been such a purist on this, even though that shot bugs me a little bit. I'm going to leave it, the way that when we screened it theatrically, it looked. And, I'm a huge Orson Welles fan. In fact, a couple of the projects we're developing as producers are projects that Orson Welles had originally been involved with. And For a long time, one of my partners and I, when we first started our quest for releasing lost movies in distribution, looked endlessly for the outtakes from Magnificent Ambersons. We really spent quite a lot of time on it because I really think it was Wells' second movie that he lost control of for reasons that people still argue about, is only shown in sort of a butchered version. But Dennis and I talked about Orson all the time, and it was funny. He was still going out to work on Other Side of the Wind, and so when it finally came out, this very long version of it, Dennis is in it for like a few seconds, a minute or two, a couple of minutes at most, and I remember I was at a screening. I was talking to the editor of the final version of it, and I said, "Where's all of Dennis's footage?" And they went kind of back and kind of looking at stuff, and they did put together this Hopper Wells documentary, which really couldn't be used. The Hopper footage couldn't really be used, I guess, for the movie itself, because at that point, when Dennis was doing it, Orson was playing the director. Ultimately, he brought in John Huston to play the director, and I guess most of the footage with Dennis was with Orson. So it's their conversations, and it's really Dennis playing Dennis. There's a remarkable documentary called American Dreamer, and one of the people I have as a bonus feature on the Severin disc, Severin disc set, is Lawrence Schiller, who's a very interesting filmmaker. He had been a photographer originally, and he's the one who did all the famous photographs of Marilyn Monroe in the swimming pool. He knew Marilyn quite well. And he also did the interviews for Norman Mailer with Gary Gilmore, the killer who was the subject of Norman Mailer's book, Executioner's Song. And then he went on to do movies as a director, too. And he did this documentary about Dennis called American Dreamer, which is the period after Easy Rider, when Dennis kind of had the keys to Hollywood and did his dream project, The Last Movie, which took him a couple of years in post-production. And it's all about that period. And Dennis kind of went off the rails, I think he admitted himself, and put together this movie that was, very beautifully shot and beautifully made, and edited this kind of in the style of European New Wave movies of the time, like Antonioni's movies, and kind of completely fell flat. And Universal hated Dennis Hopper, so much so that during the same period when I was releasing Out of the Blue, I had a producing and writing deal at Universal. And unbeknownst to me, the head of the studio had been Dennis Hopper's executive on the Last Movie. And I was having breakfast with him, and we were developing a couple of interesting projects from books that I loved. I'd been a literary major at Harvard, so there were these books I wanted to do and adapt. And he said, "Well, what else do you have?" And I said, "Well, I'm releasing this little movie with Dennis Hopper, who hadn't directed anything in almost a decade since The Last Movie, because it had been such a disaster, both not critically so much, but commercially and from an industry point of view." And I remember the head of the studio put down his cup of coffee. He said, "John, if you ever say the words Dennis Hopper in my presence again, you will never step foot on the lot at Universal." And I was waiting for him to crack a smile, and he never did. And I hadn't seen American Dreamer yet. But when you see it, you'll understand why it was such a point of contention. He's a very sweet man. Dennis and I had a number of things we wanted to work on together. He was a huge, huge supporter of mine. I would never have, as I was of his, of course, he thought I should direct. And I said to him, well, I'm a writer, and I think I understand a little bit about editing, but I don't know anything about actors or working with actors. And he said, I can teach you that. And as we went around the country, he really taught me about acting and about working with actors and gave me a lot of confidence. And it was one of the reasons why Radio Free Album, with the movie I directed, would never have happened if not for Dennis. I'd never thought about directing if it hadn't been for Dennis's influence and his encouragement. So that's a kind of long way back into talking about Orson and Dennis, and the fact that out of the blue, Dennis had not originally been hired to direct it.
Yeah.
He had been hired just as an actor. And but he'd had a lot to say about it. He had helped cast Sharon Farrell as the wife because he met her through the production manager, the line producer, Paul Lewis, before the movie had started. And Dennis was really the star of it, along with Linda Manz. But the screenwriter was going to direct it as his sort of first real movie. He'd done an award-winning documentary, and he'd done a little indie movie. But this was his first time really working with professional actors. And about a week into the movie, Dennis hadn't worked, and the footage was deemed really not usable, and they were going to shut down production. And Dennis had gotten to be friends with Linda Manz, who'd been the little girl in Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven, in which she was really remarkable. And he saw something in her that he thought he could really bring out. I think that was really why he volunteered to take over the movie. He rewrote it in the weekend. It was really going to be sort of aimed at an after-school audience kind of audience for the movie, with Raymond Burr as a psychiatrist who helps this troubled girl with a kind of hopeful ending. And Dennis brought in the whole punk rock element. He was sort of fascinated by punk rock and the Vancouver punk rock scene. And he was great friends with Neil Young. The movie was originally going to be called CB, for the name of the character that Linda plays. And he heard out of the blue on the radio and said, that's it. The king is gone, Elvis, but not forgotten. This is the story of Johnny Rotten, punk music. And he made Linda be a punk rock music fan. And he knew that she played drums and a little bit of guitar. And he sort of built the movie around what he knew about her, which is really how he liked to work with actors, and kind of transformed the movie. It became a lot more improvisational. Dennis had a particular way of working in the realm of improvisation. He would bring in actors and in the morning on set and talk about the scene, and they would do some improvisation, and then he would set it, and then that's what they would do for the scene itself. And one of the things he told me, he loved long takes, because he said he'd learned it from Orson, that they could. He wanted to make it that they couldn't cut his movie, truthfully. So he would do long master takes and very little coverage, if any. And there's that amazing scene. I remember I was just blown away by it near the beginning of the movie. It's a 6 or 7 minute scene, I think, where Linda Manz, the daughter, comes into the restaurant where her mother is working, and it's just one long shot, taking them all around the restaurant and then settling on them at the table, talking, having a long conversation. And it's just brilliant. And so Dennis was a filmmaker who had his really his own aesthetic. And of course, in the years since Out of the Blue came out, I'm very proud that it kind of relaunched his career as a director. Because of it, coming out in LA, Sean Penn saw it and kind of lobbied for him to direct Colors. And Dennis invited me on the set of that. And Dennis was just a very generous mentor. He invited me on the set of Rumblefish in Tulsa when he was doing it with Francis Coppola, who'd also been kind of a big influence on mine and helped me starting my little distribution company. Um, so yeah, it's kind of been very interwoven with my career. So doing this restoration was really kind of payback. I recruited Elizabeth on board to help on, particularly on the social media and fundraising side of it. And, uh, we had a great time. And I thought it was, it really kind of made a lot of new friends for us, uh, and new friends for the movie. And I'm just really pleased with how it looks and how people have responded. If you go on Letterboxd, you see all these new reviews, and that's kind of young
Yeah.
people, social media, who are just discovering the movie for the first time. When we played LA, we had the US premiere at the Metrograph in New York for 2 weeks. It's really unheard of for a restoration to play that long, but sold out even during the pandemic. It sold out screenings. And in LA, we played like a month at the American Cinematheque venues in Hollywood and Santa Monica. And then a few months later, played at this cool new cinema uh, called Brain Dead Studio that had been the Cine Family, where we had played the 35 millimeter restoration. And Linda Manns had come out for that, and I did a Q&A with her for it 10 years ago. But we played Brain Dead and sold out, at a sold out screening, after playing a month uh, in other venues earlier last year. So whole new audiences are discovering. We just played in Melbourne and had sold out screenings and played 2 weeks in Australia.
Fantastic.
So it's been kind of a labor of love to do this. It kind of got me back interested in distribution a little bit, which I really hadn't been doing. I've been really focusing on my career as a writer and producer and director since then.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth as my partner in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really interesting. Like, I think about, my relationship with Dennis Hopper's films. I think for people that are in my age group, I'm in my mid 30s. A lot of what I know about Dennis Hopper is for when he was an actor. And honestly, the movies that I think about are like the movie Speed, where he was the bad guy in that movie. And, but then as I've gotten older, as I've become more of a Blu-ray physical media collector, and along with this release itself, it's gotten me so much more into Dennis Hopper's earlier career. The first thing I of course discovered was Easy Rider, and then, as you said, Indicator put out The Last Movie, which is a great release, and then this Out of the Blue film, and then of course some of his other films have started to pepper out there. I think Kino put out the Hot Spot, I think is one of his other films from the 90s. I think they just put that out on Blu-ray. And I think just announced was Backtrack is getting a Blu-ray release.
Oh,
yes. So yeah. And it's called it's got an alternate title, I think, that's on the cover, but
yeah, it's Catch Fire.
Yeah. Catch Fire. Yeah. So I'm loving personally, that I'm discovering more and more about Dennis Hopper as a filmmaker and not just as an actor, though he was a wonderful actor, that he was this overall artist that I hadn't been aware of yet.
Yeah. The deeper you go into Dennis Hopper's filmography, you end up discovering things. For me, I mean, my first introduction to Dennis Hopper was David Lynch's Blue Velvet. And that was kind of my mindset of Dennis Hopper. And then, going back to Easy Rider and then going back to even his earlier roles. One of my favorite films of all times is Rebel Without a Cause. And I was a very early role, a young Dennis Hopper in that film. And you begin to go back and see kind of him popping up in over and over again throughout the decades, from the 50s all the way up really until his passing. He was always kind of, in things and always around, and people knew him. And then I think what's great about the Out of the Blue release is a lot of people are going to discover this film for the first time. I mean, I know I did. I know Steven probably did, and many of the other people that we talked to. And with all of the screenings that you've been doing, and then with this physical media release here, and then the other ones around the world, more people are going to learn about Dennis Hopper even after he has passed, which just kind of shows, the power of legacy, the power of movies, how movies kind of, exist forever in some way, shape, or form, and the people who influence them and are a part of them kind of exist forever in some way. It's kind of beautifully poetic, if I could say that. But I would say, just kind of, now that you kind of talked about all of this, I guess it's appropriate to go back to kind of maybe before you had gotten involved with Out of the Blue, and kind of like the origins of, your love of movies and where all that began. I'm assuming it began earlier on in your life.
Right. Well, I want to say one thing though too about Dennis and James Dean. I mean, the three thing. Every time I saw Dennis, we traveled around the country together for the release of Out of the Blue, and one of the things we did. This is a good story that I should tell before I forget it. Is that Dennis really, his career was at a low ebb. I'd been an editor of the Harvard Crimson when I was an undergrad there, and when we premiered the movie in Boston, I said, "Oh, let's go into the Crimson, and someone will do an interview with you." No one wanted to do an interview with Dennis Hopper. I was just so shocked. It hadn't been that long ago. I'd been an undergrad, and I would have jumped at the chance to interview him. Everyone's always. I mean, when I was an undergrad there, and I wanted to review movies, I sometimes had to hitchhike down to New York to see a movie before it played in Boston or Cambridge in order to get dibs on reviewing it. I that's how obsessed with doing things people were. But nobody wanted to interview Dennis Hopper, and he would always tell me, "Oh man, Jack and Warren love my movie, love Out of the Blue." As in Nicholson, Jack Nicholson, and Warren Beatty. I said, well, finally I kind of got sick of hearing it. I said to him, I knew him well enough, I could say, well, how's that going to help us? He goes, oh man, you don't understand about Jack. He has this little book that he keeps in his back pocket. And if you're one of his friends, your name is written in it. And if you ask him for a favor, he takes it out right in front of you, opens it to the page where your name is, shows you your name, and then crosses it out and does you the favor. So, long pause. I said, well, time to get your name crossed out. So we flew up to Aspen and spent the weekend with Nicholson at his place there. And I recorded a conversation of the three of us, mostly them, talking about movies, and I would steer it back to Out of the Blue, and out of that I put together a radio spot that's on the Blu-ray that we used to open Boston. This is Jack Nicholson. I want to tell you about a movie I'm not in, I had nothing to do with, but if a masterpiece comes along, people should see it. I'm abbreviating it, and that helped the movie enormously. But Dennis was so influenced by James Dean. He told me that I'm Rebel Without a Cause. He thought he was the hot young actor. But his jaw dropped open when he met Dean and saw how Dean worked. They became best friends. And there's some dispute, but they may have shared an apartment together for a while. And he just learned about acting from Dean, and he told me he was going to go out driving with him in his new Porsche when he had the fatal car crash. But he could still be moved to tears talking about Dean, 20 years later when I knew him, and maybe not 20, 15 years later, I guess. And really influenced him. So Wells as a filmmaker and Dean as an actor were really two of his huge influences. And he also loved Bob Dylan, which is another love of mine. So those were three things we talked about a lot of the time when we were together. And Neil Young. And Dennis took me to meet Neil because Neil had made a movie with Dennis called Human Highway. And he wanted me to see it to see if I thought I could help Neil do something with it. And it was just not a movie that I thought I could really help with releasing at the time. But I'm glad it's finally gotten kind of a life on Blu-ray too. And it was fun to meet Neil Young, who also is a great hero and was a great friend and supporter of Dennis Hopper.
Yeah, most definitely.
I mean, he
So
gave him the music to use for free in the movie. And
I,
there's some dispute. He was going to give him more songs too, but there was some dispute between Dennis and the producers of the movie over final cut. So it ended up that there were just the two songs, Thrasher and Out of the Blue,
yeah,
in the film of Neil Young's. But the other music is great in it too. That Dennis did end up finding a terrific Canadian singer songwriter to do for him, and I've got an interview with that Tom Lavin, who's still around and still performing. That's on the Blu-ray.
yeah. So, John, let's go back to your personal beginnings. Like you've talked about being a film critic, a writer. Would you say is that the beginning of your? I mean, I know that's probably not the beginning of your love for movies.
Well,
Where
the
would you?
love my big. I grew up in Chicago,
Yeah,
and I went to Chicago public schools, which weren't very good, and I was kind of fortunate to get a scholarship to go to Harvard. But before that, my parents were big movie fans, and my mother especially, she couldn't afford babysitters, so she took me to see all of these European movies, Bergman movies, and Truffaut. And I remember seeing 400 Blows when I was very little boy. I was probably younger than the character of Antoine Doinel in 400 Blows. And I remember thinking when I saw Out of the Blue, that it was really part of my love for it. I wasn't really into punk. Punk was never the music that really moved me particularly. I mean, there were things I liked, like the Sex Pistols and the Clash, which are not really pure punk, I guess. But I saw it as a portrait of alienation on a par with 400 Blows. And there's a great Tony Richardson British movie called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. That was one of my father's favorite movies that we watched on television together. And so that was my real love of it. And when I went to grad school, I went to a writer's workshop program in the Midwest and started writing film reviews that got picked up by kind of alternate papers in the Midwest. And I met Roger Ebert doing that, and Ebert had me fill in for him when he went on vacation and recommended me to the New Orleans paper, where I went down there and became sort of the film critic and writing about the arts for the New Orleans paper, music and film, and also news and features. And when I was down there, I never went to film school. But when I was at Harvard, one of the perks of being a Crimson editor was that we got a pass to this amazing theater in Cambridge called the Orson Welles Cinema. And they had 3 screens, and they would play like a new art house movie, and then they would play kind of retrospectives. So there were days when I would just spend the whole day at the Orson Welles Cinema, seeing every Bergman, every Truffaut, every Satyajit Ray. And they also had a restaurant where they would theme it to the cuisine of what they were playing. And if you waited till after 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, you could go in and get whatever they had left over for $1. Because otherwise my girlfriend and I couldn't afford it. So after seeing all, like 6 movies, we'd go in and get, dinner for $2 at the Orson Welles restaurant. So that was my film education. But when I was in New Orleans, I knew I wanted to make films, and I made it a point to meet any filmmaker came into New Orleans. And one of them was Francis Ford Coppola. And I talked him into letting me do an interview. I rode back with him to the airport from his hotel. He was there to give a keynote address and pick up an award from the National Association of Theater Owners. And when I'd been a film critic, I'd pick The Conversation as the best movie of the year. So he and I kind of bonded over that. And he told me that the only reason he'd done Godfather 2 was because of The Conversation had kind of hurt him financially. He had set up his own company to make and release movies with William Friedkin and Peter Bogdanovich, and all of the movies had been unsuccessful. And he felt because the studios tanked them to kind of put them back in their place as guns for hire. And he said if he'd had it do over again, he'd start a distribution company. So down in New Orleans, that was in the back of my mind. And one night when I was working late at the newspaper, kind of as the night city editor, I got a call from this guy who had been bit by a rat at a movie theater. And it was this TV host named Sterling Smith. And everyone who was hip kind of hated Sterling Smith because he would appear on these UHF. He had his own show called Critics' Choice, where he would appear in a powder blue tuxedo, puffing on a fake pipe, and kind of pontificating about movies in this very pompous way. But he'd gotten bit by a rat, so I went out to meet him, and we became friends. And I discovered, number one, that he wasn't like 60 years old. He was really only 40. He was prematurely gray, and he was really smart and really hip. This was kind of an act, though nobody got it. And he knew everything about shelved and lost movies. And he had made a movie that was shelved in New Orleans called Mary Ann, that the director Noel Black, who had done Pretty Poison, which was a great 70s indie movie, had directed. And Mary Ann was with Kitty Wynn, who had been in Panic in Needle Park with Al Pacino. And her career had kind of gone nowhere after the movie was shelved, Mary Ann. And he had tried to distribute a Christopher Lee horror movie with Peter Cushing called Nothing But the Night. And all of these things had ended up in lawsuits. So I kind of convinced him, let's find another shelved movie. And that was The Wicker Man. And we restored it with footage that had been cut out. And that kind of put us on the map. We kind of went our separate ways for reasons that are too long and boring to go into. But I ended up doing most of the release of Wicker Man on my own, and then came to Out of the Blue. But in between it, a really great lost movie called The Haunting of Julia that Richard Loncraine had directed with Mia Farrow.
Oh, nice.
From a Peter Straub novel, who I became friends with. And that was the first project I developed at Universal, was another Peter Straub novel, because he and I became friends while Ghost Story was being released, and Universal didn't involve him in it at all. But, one of the things I did was involve him very much in the release of Haunting of Julia from his novel Julia, which in the UK, the movie was called Full Circle.
Mm. So would you say, when it comes to your background as a writer, did that help you? I mean, like, because you talk about how, Dennis Hopper being an actor really helped him as a director. You think being very much behind the scenes as a writer really helps inform you as a filmmaker as well? Do you think because Dennis Hopper's known for saying, it's just a blueprint, the script's just a blueprint. It's not really, something, it's a guide. It's not really something that makes the movie. But, you being somebody that eventually directed a movie, was that background still helpful for you as making a movie as well?
Well, most of the writing I've done as a screenwriter has been adaptations.
Okay.
They're very difficult for a number of reasons. One of which is, the reason I did that was, number one, because I love good writing, and there were all these lost books, like lost movies, that I wanted to adapt, like from Jim Thompson, great noir writer, and Philip K. Dick before he was so rediscovered again. But the problem is severalfold. One of the problems is that novels, if it's a really good novel, that's the form that it finds. And in a certain way, you're taking a perfectly good table and trying to turn it into a chair.
Mm.
You might almost be better off starting off from scratch, because it's founded its expression. That's why so many great, really great novels don't make great movies.
Hmm.
Very rarely do they. I mean, The Godfather, which is arguably one of the greatest American movies, is not a great novel in my opinion. It's it's a very popular novel. It's kind of a potboiler. So it's difficult to do adaptations. Also, as a screenwriter, uh, you're really working for the director, even if you're a producer, as I am on all our projects. Um, so, if you're bringing it, one of the things you hate the most is for somebody to reread the novel before they read your screenplay, because you want it to stand on its own and look to its strengths and weaknesses on its own. So it's kind of a difficult task, but I felt that one of the reasons I wanted to do it was that you were trading off on getting. It's hard to get people to read scripts, uh, no matter who you are, um, and no matter how good a screenwriter you are. It's hard to get people to read scripts. I have a saying, which is, if you never want to hear from someone again, give them a script, and it's more true than not. But the at least if it's from a writer who has a really good reputation, as opposed to something, that John Simon came up with out of his own head and thought was great, you're kind of one step closer to getting people to read it. But it's still very difficult. Like right now, I'm doing a rewrite for a director who we like, from a novel that I adapted, and it's kind of going in a way in the wrong direction somewhat, in terms of he keeps wanting to go back to the novel. And
Mm.
A studio movie that I developed and was a writer on, the not credited, but did write several drafts of, was The Getaway. And the studio kept wanting to go back to the original movie. That was even the Peckinpah movie. That was even more of a problem, because I didn't think the movie was as good as the novel, the Peckinpah version of The Getaway. I love Peckinpah, but I
Hmm.
thought it was not one of his best movies, personally. Tastes can differ. And, but the draft that I did, the Walter Hill was originally going to direct, was taking it more back to the novel.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the studio, when another director came on board, Roger Donaldson, who I really like and did a good job, and very proud of the movie in other respects, kept kind of morphing back to the kind of happy end of the movie, as opposed to the really surreal and cynical end of the novel, which was why I wanted to do it in the first place, probably one of the main reasons.
Yeah, I think especially in today's culture, there's a lot of issues with people not looking at something that's coming out new without having the blinders on of the previous version, like especially like
Mm.
these comic book films, all these comic book films,
Right.
all the comic book lovers out there, every time a new one of these movies comes out, they're like comparing it to the comic. They're like they're like, is it going to be like this? And it's like, well, that's a whole other medium. That's a whole other way of telling stories. It can't be exactly what that thing is. And
Right.
novels, of course, are so much more detailed and so much more, there's so much more there that you just can't put in a film, because film is just it's a combination of all different mediums, and it's too much
Yeah,
information.
I would. Yeah, you're right. There's not a 1-to-1 ratio of adapting something from one medium to another. It's just kind of something you can't put like, let's say you can't put like square pegs in round holes or something like that.
That whatever the
Um,
phrase is. Yeah.
Whatever the phrase is, but you understand what I'm saying. Is sometimes things don't match up exactly the way you want them to be or the way they're supposed to be. And I would even say, when it comes to what Stephen, you were just saying, there's an awful lot of remakes now. You were just saying, John, with the remake of The Getaway, people were looking at the Sam Peckinpah film. This was back in the '90s. It's more so now when there's such a large platform of open discussion and open forums. in social media. You see this all the time where some type of remake comes out or a sequel to a movie that came out 30, 40 years ago. They compare it to that in terms of quality, as opposed to letting something kind of exist within itself first and foremost, and evaluating it on that. They automatically revert to comparing it to its previous incarnation, and that's how they evaluate things, which is that's a
It's
separate discussion in my
it
opinion,
suppressed artists from being artists, and
because
Well,
it
one of
makes them
the
have to be beholden to the old thing when they want to do their own thing.
Well, one of the reasons is that, and I feel like to somewhat, I'm still atoning for my career as a film critic. Film critics really have very little understanding of how movies are made, myself included when I was one, and so they seize on something that you can write about easily, which is to compare the movie to other movies, whether it's a different version of it. I was always a huge fan of the Dario Argento's Suspiria. In fact, I developed a project with Dario Argento when I had that producing deal at Universal from a Peter Straub novel. He wanted to do it. I couldn't get Universal to finance it to approve him as a director. But and I was involved actually with the first home video release of Suspiria in the U.S. through a company that I had a label deal with. But this remake of Suspiria, which was kind of panned by almost everybody, I think is brilliant. I mean, it's a completely different take on the material, and it's completely about something different things than the original is about. But it's just a beautiful and fascinating movie with you wouldn't think anyone could top that great score that Argento had with Goblin for Suspiria. But Luca Guadagnino, if I'm pronouncing his name right, I've never.
it was close. It was better than I would have done.
Yeah, Steven is notorious for mispronunciations. It's kind of a
Well,
running thing on
we'll
here.
we'll just call him Luca. But his movie, he got Tom York to do the score, and it's from Radiohead, and it's just a fantastic score. I love that score, and the movie itself is breathtakingly good with brilliant acting. But you can't compare it to the original movie. It's like it's like trying to compare West Side Story to Romeo and Juliet. It's inspired by the same. It's the same source material, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet,
Yeah.
to the Shakespeare's original. It's stories that are great transcend what can be done with them. I always like to say that we're still sort of in the dark ages of film criticism, because nobody today would say what they used to say in the 19th and early 20th century, which is that something is not a suitable subject for a painting, right? Art has advanced way past that, where Van Gogh is not accepted in his own time because he did paintings of field workers, whereas people thought paintings needed to be of elevated subjects, of dukes and kings. And this was the 18th and 19th century aesthetic of painting. And nobody thinks that anymore, that what the subject of a painting is matters in the slightest. You can do a picture of a dead fish, and in photography too, or in paintings. But movies win Academy Awards because of their subject, which to me is, it's not unimportant. But why is look at the movies that Guess Who's Coming to Dinner won the Academy Award against. It's a not very well made movie in many ways, but it was about a subject that people wanted to vote their consciences, which is not really about the craft of filmmaking. It's nice when it's employed, like this movie Till this year is a terrific movie. I was so pleasantly surprised by how well acted and well made, well shot, and well edited it is. But that's apart from the fact that it's about a subject worthy of social conversation. Movies that are worthy of social conversation, that doesn't mean it's a great movie. Till is a really excellent, great movie because of the filmmaking. And
Yeah.
it's enhanced by the fact that it's about a powerful subject. Anyway, that's
Mm.
my 2 cents.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, filmmaking as an art form can, like you said, enhance certain themes and subject matters, or really be a palette to kind of express those things in a unique way. And oftentimes it's a reflection of the society in which we live in. You know what I mean? You just mentioned the movie Till. That a film dealing with, racism within our society is still extremely prevalent today. You know what I mean? As it was when the events originally took place. If that movie had been made 30 years ago, it would still be relevant because, it's still reflecting something that's still part of our society. And movies are kind of, you know, have always done that. And I think the best movies kind of stay with us and stay within the public consciousness because of the time, like the timeliness or the timelessness of what they're talking about. And like you said, the craft. Uh, it's I think it's more easy now to learn about the basic craft of movie making than anything. We have so much more access to knowledge of movie making as opposed to people, 30 or 40 years ago, which, the way in which you had to learn about filmmaking was you went to film school. That was kind of really the only place you could really learn about it. Unless, you did a hefty amount of library work on your own, I guess. But you kind of had to go to filmmaking as opposed to now where you can be on the other side of the world from Hollywood and learn how to make movies. It's really kind of just, the way our society and culture has advanced, we
Or
learn
or
so
or
much
have a
now.
great mentor, which is,
Mm,
something like, bringing it
very
back
true.
to Dennis Hopper.
Well, even then you almost have to like go to, you have to be in a specific place to meet a Dennis Hopper, to
Sure.
meet a mentor.
Well, I was going to say Dennis Hopper himself. I believe he did a lot of stuff with Roger Corman early on. And
Yes.
I'm sure Roger Corman was a big influence for him as well. In the sense of filmmaking. Um, so yeah, it takes a lot of luck, takes a lot of being in the right place at the right time. But
Especially for
um,
that generation of filmmakers. I mean, they
oh
kind of
yeah,
were
yeah,
all in that area of independent filmmaking with Roger Corman, with BBS, with all that kind of work, and there you can still see the influence on their filmmaking today. I mean, they radically changed the way movies were made. You know what I mean? This kind of guerrilla style, bringing it to the people version of filmmaking, which isn't as polished as like the previous generations, like a Cecil B. DeMille or someone like that. And it's kind of interesting how Out of the Blue very much fits into that era of filmmakers of filmmaking. And I think that's kind of why its legacy is still brought
I,
back today and still relevant today.
I think
I
with
think it's
this
why,
release,
like John
yeah.
says, when you go on Letterboxd and you see all these people discovering this movie for the first time and rating it, and they're rating it really high. They're like, where has this movie been for so long? It's kind of, did you notice, John, that the movie had kind of disappeared, since it came out in 1980, and then until this kind of restoration process was take undertaken?
Well, that, to some extent, that was because we were limited to the 35 millimeter, 235 millimeter prints. And I we screened them only uh, rarely because you know, you can't make 35 millimeter prints anymore. Technicolor isn't in the film business anymore. We'd done the 35 millimeter restoration at Technicolor and struck, a new inner positive and as a protection element. And the but there's nowhere to make 35 millimeter prints from the out of the blue negative, really not possible. So we scanned the negative for this, and the technology has gotten less expensive. It was still expensive, and it was still, you know the place where we did it, Roundabout Entertainment, did the 4K restoration of Apocalypse Now, and they just did The Conversation and Raging Bull. So they're really the top end. And I had to kind of work my way in when they had downtime and kind of fit myself around their big paying customers. They loved Out of the Blue and helped me, bring it in at a budget that we could manage with the Kickstarter funding and some private funding and our own funding for the restoration and re-release. And I think that these movies of the 70s and 80s were early 80s, late 60s, early 70s, late 60s and the 70s, were an era where filmmakers could really be empowered. And it didn't work out that well financially. I mean, they looked at things like Easy Rider, which revolutionized Hollywood. I wrote that card at the beginning of the restoration about the fact that, it changed Hollywood forever, but in many ways, not just in terms of indie filmmaking. Corman I knew Roger pretty well and worked with him on a couple of things. And, that was not the most necessarily hospitable place to indie filmmakers. A lot of the filmmakers that he discovered and gave their first chance, like Coppola and Scorsese and Ron Howard and Monty Hellman, went off to do more personal work elsewhere. Roger always had his eye on the bottom line and on making movies as inexpensively as possible and as marketable as possible. And he was great. Nobody was ever better at that than Roger. And filmmakers like Coppola and like Scorsese went off to do their own thing and their own movies. And Dennis really paved the way for that with Easy Rider, where they could get real financing. And today, it's kind of the best of all worlds and the worst of all worlds, because you can go make a movie for $20,000 on your iPhone. And it will look great, but getting anybody to watch it, that's hard, number one. And number two, getting anybody to release it is hard, because the costs of releasing a movie have not really changed. So something like, I think there are better. Paranormal Activity is great, and everyone who wants to make a low budget horror movie points to that as, we're going to make the next Paranormal Activity, or Blair Witch Project or whatever very ultra low budget movie. But the problem is that you may spend $100,000 to make Paranormal Activity, but you're asking Paramount to spend $20 million to release it. And you got to have pretty big balls if you're a studio to say, we're going to put $20 million behind this, $100,000 movie. You're going to lose your job. You're going to get put in an insane asylum if you're the guy who suggests that. So it's very tough. And I think most of the interesting work that's being done at a very low budget movie, we often consult with filmmakers, come to us. We don't really do distribution so much anymore, except for Out of the Blue. But people come to us and ask us to, what to do. And the earlier we get involved, the better. I mean, I think you're better off making something very personal that might get into Sundance, might help launch your career, won't make its money back. Most movies that cost $30,000, they lose $30,000 or more, because then you have to release them or market them or do something with it. Movies that cost $40 million don't lose $40 million. They may lose money, but it won't be their entire budgets, because they have name stars in it, name actors. And movies that are bad for the two same reasons almost always, which is the acting and the script. And those are two things where you really have to pay attention. And the script, it's free to work on, and acting, you can find great actors, but you can't do it with your friends and non-professionals. You have to find, in my opinion, you have to find professional actors. It's not unheard of. There's always exceptions, but you won't get anyone to take your movie seriously without SAG union actors in it who know what they're doing, and you need them for the small parts, right? Not just the big parts.
Yeah.
That's where movies are really bad, as you find out quickly, is in the guy who's the shopkeeper, not the lead.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the background characters that you got to fill in the world with reality. And if the world around the main characters are not feeling like reality, you're like, yeah,
Yeah,
it could get a little weird.
you distance yourself from the film while you're watching it, and it's like
Yeah.
the further away you get from it, the more disengaged you are, and then you lose interest in the film. People's attention spans are relatively short these days. They really don't want to sit for too long in one place. Yeah, everybody's constantly moving, constantly going in a bunch of different directions. That's kind of the way life is. So for films to really grab you, like you said, the screenplay, I think, is the make or break. You know what I mean? A great screenplay can really,
It
really.
gives you the ultimate starting place if you have a
It's
great
also
script.
it's kind of like the nervous system, or the the blood system of a movie. You know what I mean? The heart of it all. You know what I mean? It spreads out and just keep the body of the movie going. If I can use that metaphor, if you will. There are very very often times where acting, I find, can maybe elevate a weaker script, but you can only do so much. As you said, John, there's only so much an
Well,
actor can do.
I think Out of the Blue is an example of, like, I
Mm,
mean, like, obviously Dennis Hopper worked on a script, but it was done in a weekend, and it was like, something that hadn't been really, fully sat with for very long. So it was the acting and the drive of the people involved that made that film, so good.
Well, he knew what he wanted to communicate. I mean, that's
Yeah,
the biggest issue. He knew what he wanted to say. He knew where he wanted to go as an actor. I think, of all the performances Dennis Hopper gave in his career, I think Out of the Blue is his very best. I've always thought that.
yeah.
The other one, the
I
other
can't
one,
argue.
and he directed himself, which is not easy. Movies that are often very good with really good actors, where the actor directed, the it's not their strongest performances. I thought that well, I won't disparage anything, but most movies, it's very hard to wear both hats for someone. I think actors make very good directors, but directing themselves is very challenging. And Dennis goes to some very raw and naked places in the movie, and he got Linda to go to those places, and he got Sharon Farrell as his wife to go to those places. And it's fascinating, the interview I did with Sharon for the disc. For many years, Sharon uh, felt traumatized by the experience of making Out of the Blue, and wouldn't talk about it. And for many years, the original writer director of it, Leonard Yakir, wouldn't talk about it. And I got the first interview with him for this Blu-ray release that's on it, talking about what he had wanted to do. And we even included this short documentary that he made that has a lot of resonances with Out of the Blue, kind of about a Skid Row character who's not entirely unlike the character that Dennis plays in Out of the Blue. And Leonard's a very bright guy, and he deserves credit for what I think is one of the great father-daughter castings of all time, which is Dennis and Linda Manns. There's this scene in the movie where Sharon Farrell is with her daughter, and Linda says to her, "Who do I look more like, you or Dad?" And she says, "Your father." And she goes, "Oh, Girl Don, that's the name of the character." She goes, "No, that's not it. It's like you have his energy, you have his attitude." And Dennis kept that line in, for a reason, or gave them that line for a reason, because Linda Manns really did have that energy, and we haven't talked about her much.
I was actually
She
going to bring
was
it to her next. Yeah.
she
Yeah,
was
good transition.
she was a phenomenal person who I got to know when I originally released the movie, and she had a tough life. She was a street kid who was discovered by Malick for Days of Heaven, and he brought her. The movie didn't really work in post production, and he brought her in to do that voiceover narration that he didn't write. It was really improvised by Linda with Malick in post production. And if you don't remember anything else about Days of Heaven, you remember how beautiful the wheat fields are, and you remember her voiceover, her narration, which is so unique. And that's who Linda was. She really was this very authentic person. And after we premiered in Venice, I went out to see her. Elizabeth and I out to see her. She had kind of retired from acting because there really weren't parts for her. She had done Harmony Korine's movie Gummo, but really nothing after that except a little walk-in in David Fincher's The Game. And she had raised a family, and but she was still the same as she had been when I first released the movie, and she was kind of living kind of a nomadic life in Hollywood, and she, she had a little shrine out of the blue in her house, in her breakfast nook, where she had the poster and she had photos, and it was her favorite part. And she was so excited that we were restoring it and re-releasing it. And we'd gotten into South by Southwest. We were going to do the premiere, and I was thinking I'd bring Linda. And she was all excited about it, but she still had this kind of childlike quality. And she said, I said, well, we'll get air tickets. She said, oh, I don't fly. And I thought, well, we're going to go to Austin. That's kind of a drive, but maybe we can do it. It was right before the shutdown. And before South by Southwest was canceled. I said, well, we can drive. It'll take, like a day and a half, but that's all right. And she goes, well, I can't go on highways. And I said, she goes, I don't want to go on highways. And I'm thinking, well, how are we going to travel from LA to Austin and not go on highways?
Mm.
And she said, some days I don't go to the mailbox. I just stay inside. It's hard for me to go to the mailbox. And I realized that we weren't going to take her to South by. And the very next day, she got the results of her biopsy and discovered that she had, advanced lung cancer. And she died a couple of months later. But she got to see and know about the restoration, which meant a lot to her. And one of the things she did to help support it was sign a bunch of original posters that we used as Kickstarter premiums. So it was great to get to see her. And I recorded a little, promotional blurb with her on video when we saw her. I thought I'd get to do a long interview, and we didn't get to do it, sadly, because of her untimely passing. But she had a very tough life. Her husband was a cameraman, and he had actually been, by weird coincidence, the cameraman on a movie that I'd been involved with I was involved with as a producer and helping raise financing on, which was Howling Part 2, which my friend Philippe Marat directed. And Philippe had done one of Dennis's best performances, Mad Dog Morgan.
Yeah.
One of the bonus features is talking about Mad Dog Morgan with Philippe and working with Dennis. And so there was that parallel. And her husband was living, basically, he had had a stroke and was in their living room. And she was kind of a full-time caregiver for him. And she'd had 3 sons. One of them had died in a motorcycle accident shortly before we went out to visit her. But she had this indomitable spirit. She was one of the most positive human beings I've ever met, as was Dennis Hopper. They both shared a very black sense of humor and really enjoyed each other's company. And Linda still loved Dennis after he was gone and long after making the movie. And so that was terrific that we got to spend some time with her and take her out. We coaxed her out to her favorite restaurant out in Palmsdale, where she was living, this very blue collar area of sort of you know look-alike homes. And yeah, and cooking was her passion. She put out a little recipe book, and her fondest memory of the film business, I think, was Out of the Blue.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great, man. And it's just a little bit of Linda Manns that we got was it's just so powerful. Just a little bit of stuff she did, and I would have to agree that this performance and the energy that was mixed together with her and Dennis Hopper just kind of make this film,
Yeah,
and
it makes it gives the film a staying power. It really does. Like I said earlier, it really the combination of movie magic, I guess, in this movie, it really, makes people come back to it and makes people discover it and really appreciate it. And I think you were saying, John, earlier that you know, you know, the Harvard Crimson had no interest in Dennis Hopper, but it just seems to happen a lot. It happened with Orson Welles as well, just to kind of connect back to that. After these people have kind of, gone on or their careers have gone, many, many years or they've passed, there's almost like a retrospective reevaluation of like, um, you appreciate them more now. You know what I mean? You really appreciate their work and their contributions and their artistry way more now that they're gone than when they were here. And it almost makes people kind of, I guess, kind of regret that. I think that is kind of what you like, kind of the way it is with Dennis Hopper and his work. I think there's more fans of him probably now than when he was with us. Um, and I would say the same with Orson Welles. I think that just the great ones always kind of last.
it's
Their
it's
legacies always kind of
bittersweet.
live on.
It's
Well,
bittersweet.
Well, the last movie, Dennis had me do a little distribution on the last movie back when we were doing Out of the Blue, and I got a couple of theaters to play it, but nobody responded to it back then. It's very much of a, I kind of, I think that Dennis maybe in some ways overthought the movie in post production. It evidently had a much more linear script, and he kind of brought sort of a new wave Antonioni kind of sensibility into the post that may have made it a little bit inaccessible for American audiences, but for sort of more sophisticated audiences, they'd already been exposed to movies like that. They've been exposed to Blow Up and La Ventura and movies that were not plot oriented. And Godard's movies, particularly. Dennis was very influenced by Godard and Antonioni. But, Dennis felt for a long time that the last movie was really his masterpiece. And I kept kind of saying to him, man, Out of the Blue, I like it better. I think it's going to live longer. I think this is the movie, you're going to be judged by. And ultimately, I was very pleased years later in an interview he did, he said, maybe this is my masterpiece. He kind of came around to understand that a movie that he did really from the gut. Because Dennis is great. One of his great regrets, he told me how he and James Dean would like to go watch the kids going to UCLA from the hillside, from up in the hills, going to classes, and think about, wow, if only we could be college students, because neither of them went to college. And of course, the college students all wanted to be movie stars like James Dean and Dennis Hopper. But, Dennis was very well read and very erudite, and we loved a lot of the same novels and a lot of the same writers, and had great conversations about literature. But I think, for Dennis, he wanted to display his erudition, perhaps more than is good for a filmmaker. And last movie is a very erudite movie, but Out of the Blue is from the gut. And when you do something from the gut, your intellect becomes a part of it inevitably. But when you do something from the intellect, your gut might not be a part of it. And the last movie is dry for my taste. I mean, I think it's a terrific movie. Don't get me wrong. I'm not knocking the last movie. But Easy Rider and Out of the Blue are more unself-conscious movies.
Yeah.
And Out of the Blue, especially, Dennis's performance is really unself-conscious. It's so raw. And he gets his fellow actors to go to this very raw place that is still shocking 40 years later to see on screen. And that same experience I had, knowing nothing about the movie, my jaw dropping open by the end of it, and the power of it, it's still there. Still has the power to shock and move audiences. And that's why Natasha Lyonne, just talking about acting, brought up Out of the Blue in that interview and was so pleased to come on board to help support the movie finding a new, younger audience of fans. And we were so lucky. Fate has been so kind to this movie. When we premiered in Venice, Chloe Sevigny was doing a Luca Guadagnino series about 30 miles away in Italy. So she was able to get the day off and come to Venice for the world premiere of the restoration and be on the red carpet with us. And Natasha Lyonne came out for the U.S. premiere, theatrical premiere at the Metrograph in New York. And our Q&A that I did with her and the artist Julian Schnabel, who was so influenced by Dennis, is a terrific bonus feature also on the Severin Blu-ray disc. And if people really want to support the movie, come to outofthebluedennishopper.com, where they can still support the bills we're still paying on the movie and get a signed limited edition copy of the Blu-ray or DVD. Or if they're feeling flush, they can get still one of the few remaining signed Linda Manns posters of the late Linda Manns and some other great stuff in connection with supporting this. And they can come on our Facebook page, Out of the Blue Dennis Hopper, where we're always engaging with audience. And Out of the Blue, I think it's Dennis Hopper on Twitter, where mostly Elizabeth Carr, who I haven't talked about enough and has been so supportive of this and such a face of the movie on social media, engaging people and bringing them on board this little pilgrimage, this passion project where we didn't take any salaries to do this. We just did it kind of as a labor of love, and hopefully we'll be able to get back to our day jobs, writing in mine of writing and the two of us producing on exciting lost projects like Out of the Blue, mostly from novels and material we're doing. So it's been great talking to you guys. Thanks so much for doing this.
Oh no, I was going to say that's a great, thanks for capping it for us perfectly like that.
You kind of slid right into that landing perfectly.
Yeah. So guys, as he said, the places to go, please, if you haven't been sold on the film through this conversation,
I don't know what else to do
for. I don't know what else is going to sell you, because he just gave you a lot.
What the hell is wrong with you?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. He that was my inner voice. He just did my inner voice for me.
He said the quiet thing out loud.
Yeah, but please go if you haven't gotten this yet, get it. What the hell's wrong with you? As John said, many places to buy this. SeverinFilms.com. I'm sure maybe Amazon or of course our sponsor Orbit DVD's got it. So please don't hesitate. Get Out of the Blue on Blu-ray or 4K. John, thanks for joining us, man. It was a great, a lot of great stories.
My pleasure. Anything I didn't mean to necessarily stick the ending. If there's anything any burning questions, or I'm happy to answer them.
I mean, maybe, but like, I feel like we
I
could
feel
just
like
get
this
you to
is
come back
perfect.
one day.
Do it for
I just
another
wanna-
time. Save
We'll
it.
do it. We'll do it again on the next time maybe one of your new projects is starting to get out there a little bit. Maybe we can bring you back and talk about something new.
That'd be great. Thank you guys for doing this. And can they still vote for Out of the Blue as Restoration of the Year? Is that closed?
It just closed last weekend. Last Sunday was
Oh,
the
all
last
right.
day to vote. So we got a good amount for our first year. We got a good amount of votes. So we'll be that's coming up on February 19th. Of course I can't say anything about what the final votes are. I can't. Brian would kill me. But
Is there an event? Is there something that's going to actually happen?
Yes, so February 19th on YouTube, which if you go to, it'll either be on our channel, Disconnected, or there is a Shelf Shock Rewind YouTube channel. You can subscribe to that, and me and Ryan will be doing a live event where we kind of do our version of the Oscars, where we will have show off all the nominations. We'll have some special guests, and then we will be presenting all the winners through that live event. It'll start at 7 p.m. Eastern on Sunday, February 19th. So,
well, send Elizabeth and I will try to attend. Send us an invite.
Oh, sure. That would be great. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, John. We appreciate the talk, and we'll see you later.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.